Our next guest today, we are so grateful to have you, Julie, is Dr. Julie Panesi, and she is a professor of an ethics professor from the Western University, and she has a background in bioethics, and she has some very serious ethical concerns that she can share with us about the current COVID situation. Thank you, Julie. I think you're muted. Yeah, there we go.
Wait, there we go. Well, I was just saying thank you so much for having me. And I just want to thank everyone who's on here today and who's working behind the scenes for your bravery and your endurance in speaking out about these crucial issues. My comments are going to focus on the university issues, the university vaccination mandate in particular, but a lot of the concepts are relevant for people in younger age groups as well. It is a well-established standard that a nation is measured by how it treats its most vulnerable members. Because the futures of our young people depend on the decisions we make now, and because they trust us to make those decisions, deciding whether to mandate COVID vaccines for young people depends on an incredibly careful analysis of the necessity, efficacy, and safety of those vaccines. Many of the factors are unknown. We don't know exactly what the long-term effects of the vaccines will have on young people's neurological and vascular systems and on their ability to bear children in the future. What we do know is that COVID poses to children and adolescents a minuscule risk of severe illness and death. We know they are not asymptomatic transmitters, so arguments about vaccinating children to protect others is immunologically and ethically unsound. We know there are safe treatments like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, and that alone means that the COVID shots should never have been authorized under interim order in the first place. We also know that the vaccines are still in phase 3 trials, which means that they are by definition investigational, and we just simply have no long-term data. Concerning adverse effects, we're seeing including myocarditis, and we're seeing more adverse events from the COVID vaccines than for every other vaccine on market in the last 3 decades. Even if the side effects of the vaccines were rare, the benefits a vaccine may offer to young people is so vanishingly small, it is not worth even a minor risk of vaccine injury. And that poses on us a weighty ethical obligation to respond very carefully and very proportionally. There are, I think, 3 important ethical considerations here. The first is that the basic ethical concept of public health is that of disproportionate harms. And the idea is that a treatment or a prophylaxis should not impose harms that are equal to or greater than what they are supposed to address. Since the pandemic was declared about 16 months ago now, young people have been living in a prolonged state of fear and anxiety, which is taking a serious toll on their physical and mental health, manifesting itself in depression, anxiety, hyperactivity, obsessive behaviors, and suicidality. As one young person recently put it, basically no one under 40 thinks that anything good will ever happen again. Now we are compounding these harms by exposing young people to, and by pressuring and bullying them to accept, an investigational vaccine with demonstrated side effects that may irreversibly alter their futures as the only way to save their loved ones and reclaim their lives. And we are downplaying these harms because of an implicit double standard in which young people who get sick from COVID matter more. Their deaths are more meaningful, apparently, than those who are harmed by the vaccines and other COVID policies. The World Health Organization is clear that mandatory vaccination should be considered only if it is necessary and proportionate to achieve an unequivocal public health benefit. Mandating the COVID shots does not meet this standard, and therefore it is ethically unjustified, especially if it doesn't allow for reasonable exceptions like medical contraindications. Secondly, it is crucial that we follow a precautionary principle. when it comes to minimally understood serious and irreversible vaccine injuries, and where the public intervention, vaccination, for example, may not solve the problem designed to correct, we should proceed with great caution. A poorly justified, better safe than sorry vaccine mandate will be costly to our most vulnerable members. Thirdly, vulnerability. Young people are a vulnerable population because of their inability fully and independently to recognize and protect their own interests, especially given the inequalities of power between themselves and the adults they trust. Ontario's Healthcare Consent Act says that there is no minimum age to provide consent for vaccination, and a child or an adolescent does not need external permission. If a person is capable of appreciating the consequences of their decision, under 18s can consent. But for their decision to be fully informed, they must understand and appreciate all the risks from COVID, which are minuscule, the risks from the vaccines, which are unknown, but the early data is very worrisome. Furthermore, the lack of robust discussion of risks versus benefits in public discourse compounds the inability to make a free, informed choice. A good example of this is when we're young and we're feeling invincible and like we have all the time in the world, fertility may hold little value for us. But that may change later in life when we realize that the decisions we made in our youth to take one of these COVID vaccines may make it difficult to conceive. In summary, by mandating COVID vaccination for young people, we are asking them to bear the burden of controlling a disease which poses to them a vanishingly small risk, and asking them to incur potential harms that will affect them more than anyone else. And you compound that with the fact that minors are being asked to give free, informed consent, something which is complicated enough for adults in this situation, and the fact that vaccine mandates threaten their right to education. These mandates are at best ethically unsupported and at worst gravely irresponsible and medically, psychologically, and ethically devastating. Perhaps the main reason for attending university, or really for educating oneself at all, is to spread one's wings, to explore opportunities, and to expand horizons in a setting that respects freedom of choice and the development of one's own ideas and sense of personhood. Now the price of admission to many universities and colleges is the forfeiture of bodily autonomy and critical thinking. A coerced medical choice is standing between students and the education they work so hard to access. University vaccination mandates will undoubtedly create a stratified student cohort, the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, and the discrimination that comes from any stratified class system. Discrimination based on medical criteria can also set a dangerous precedent for other discriminatory measures in the future, or for other younger age groups now. What we do to ensure that the physical and mental health of our young people is protected, that they have the best futures possible, and that we create the conditions that give them the greatest autonomy possible is one of the biggest responsibilities of those who raise and educate them, and the mark of any civilized democratic nation. Our young people are quite literally our future and deserve our greatest care and attention.
Thank you so much. That's really important to hear from the ethical side of these kinds of measures, what kind of ethical considerations there are. And I think you've really nailed it. You've hit them all right on the head. So we're so grateful. Parents are so grateful to you. I know you've had a lot of parents reaching out to you with the announcement of mandates in the universities, especially at Western, for residents. And so we're so grateful for you to be here and to talk and speak on that one specific topic that you are definitely an expert in. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine. You know, one of the things we're seeing now, and I'll be really quick here, is that students and parents are so grateful, you know, to lawyers like Rocco and Mrna and to the scientists like Byram and Michael for trying to defend their children's rights. But their children are just petrified that if they make a claim to being unvaccinated, they're just going to be targeted and abused and sidelined. And you just never would have thought this would have been possible in Canada. And I think we need to do everything possible to support them.
100%. That's exactly right. Thank you so much, Julie. And I know that you have, I appreciate you waiting for your turn. I know you have to go. And so thank you for being here.
Thank you, Christine.
So with that being said, I think we are going to bring in our chemistry scientist. Here we are. Welcome, welcome.
Hi, Dr. Michael Palmer is an MD, and he is an internationally educated chemistry professor and at the University of Waterloo, who has openly questioned his concerns since the start of COVID restrictions in Ontario, especially regarding university students. Michael was one of the very first to speak out, and I particularly love the fact that he was offering to have his students not have to suffer through exams because of COVID. So welcome, welcome, Dr. Palmer.
Okay, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. I'm trying to share some slides. Can they be seen? Are they visible now?
On 1 second and we'll get them in here.
Okay, thank you.
Here we go. What's going on here?
Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay, so just very briefly on my own background, I'm MD from Germany. I also have a specialization in medical microbiology and a long-standing interest in pharmacology. So what I'm going to talk about is right up my street. So let's jump right in. So I'm going to focus on vaccines. Actually, before I jump into vaccines, there's one point I want to make regarding Mrna's speech, right? Mrna brought up that there is no such thing as asymptomatic transmission of COVID disease. I just want to reaffirm that. There has been a study enrolling almost 10 million individuals in China, in the Chinese city of Wuhan, the center of the outbreak, if you will. And in this very large-scale study, there was no case of COVID-19 that could be unambiguously traced to an individual that had no other signs of the infection but a positive PCR test, right? So no case could be traced to asymptomatic infection, okay, in this very large-scale study. So the evidence is clear on that point. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the mRNA vaccine, particularly the Pfizer vaccine, which appears to be right now the most widely employed vaccine in the world. And it also appears that the FDA is getting ready to issue full approval for this particular piece of poison. Now, what we are looking at here is a figure from the original FDA documentation, which is purported to show the cumulative numbers, the accumulation of so-called COVID cases in the vaccine group of the clinical trial, right? The total was close to 20,000 individuals in this group, and also close to 20,000 in the placebo group, right? So after the first injection on day 0, the placebo group continued to accumulate cases at a steady pace, as you might expect. And the vaccine group for the first 12 days continued to accumulate cases at the very same pace, and then very sharply flattened off and went off straight to the right, okay? Which would indicate that immunity set in on day 12 exactly in the entire vaccine population. Now note, this would be before the second injection. So if it were true, it would mean that no second injection is needed, because the second injection, which would occur right around day 21, has no further effect on immunity apparently. Now, but from an immunological point of view, this is not plausible. So I looked through the study carefully and I found multiple indications for these data to be fraudulent. I called out these data as fraudulent before the first vaccine shot was fired, Okay, now let's look at some recent data from Israel. These are figures from the official website of the Israeli Ministry of Health. What we are looking at here is the percentage of cases that have been vaccinated before, and this is compared to the vaccination rate in the population. As you see, the curves are practically identical, which means that the vaccinated are exactly as likely to become infected with COVID as the unvaccinated. This is a complete and total 100% failure of the vaccine, right? You see that the numbers here start only in the age group of 20 to 29 and not below, but there's absolutely no reason or fundamental reason to expect any other results for younger vaccinees, okay? So this vaccine does not work. What does it mean? It means several things. The vaccine does not prevent disease, and if it does not prevent disease, it won't prevent transmission. So you will not protect grandpa by getting vaccinated. There's absolutely no rationale for applying this vaccine to anybody, and particularly to children. It also confirms that, as I had already pointed out earlier, that the Pfizer trial data are fabricated. Okay, there are clear multiple indications of fabrication alone in the FDA report. The FDA did not catch it, which means that the FDA review process has been broken down. You can say the same thing about the European Medicinal Agency and Health Canada and whatever. None of these agencies did their homework, probably because they had a gun to their head. Because these experts in these agencies, they are not all blind. They were clearly coerced. There is no other plausible explanation for this. Okay, so what this means is Pfizer has been lying to you and to the FDA, and the FDA either does not care or is not in a position to do something about it. And instead, they are now even apparently poised to grant full approval to the vaccine, right? So this means nobody is there to protect you. You have to protect yourself. You have to protect yourself and your children from this poison. Okay, now we are told, which as Larry already brought up to us, right, the terrible Delta variant is apparently responsible for all these more recent emergency measures. Okay, now we can ask, do these variants even exist? Are they precisely defined? And the answer is we do not know, because the only way to clearly identify, to clearly establish or refute the existence of these variants and their spread and so on would be to do complete sequencing on the entire virus genome of every case. That's not done. Okay, without doing this, we have no way of knowing what the exact profile of mutations in any given virus strain is, and there is no basis on which we can sort them neatly into bins, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and so on, as the public nomenclature now suggests. Now, without having such reliable identification, we obviously cannot know the prevalence, and without the prevalence, we cannot know the differences in infectiousness or in vaccine effectiveness. These data are completely guesswork. They are just nonsense data. It is garbage in, garbage out. Okay, but what we can say is that major differences in infectiousness or vaccine effectiveness are implausible for a priori reasons, and particularly it's completely implausible to expect that natural immunity, which you would acquire, for example, by having had COVID already, or you have had a reasonably cross-reactive, more benign coronavirus strain, this immunity will protect you alike against the original Wuhan strain and any of these alphabet soup variants. So to sum up, the variants are simply a scare story to justify continued lockdowns and to coerce repeated vaccinations. There's absolutely no scientific evidence to back this up. Okay, so I'm not going to go into detail here. I suppose Byron probably already covered this. I just want to use this slide to remind you that the mRNA vaccines consist of two components, right? We have the mRNA inside, and this is encased with a mixture of lipids, which serve specific purposes in different stages of cellular uptake and release of the mRNA into the cell. And then from the mRNA template, protein is made and so on, and this sets up the cells for attack by the immune system. Okay, now I guess that most of this also has already been covered by Byram. I just want to point out one important difference, right? So we have direct spike protein toxicity, in particular the activation of blood clotting. We have immune attack by various effector mechanisms of the immune system on the cells that express the spike protein. And if this should happen inside the circulation, then we can expect blood clotting to occur. And you are aware of the many cases of stroke, myocardial infarction, thrombosis, and so on, right? We can also have an immediate type allergy triggered by the artificial lipids, right? Some people react to these lipids in the same manner as they might to penicillin or to bee poison. Now, what all these damage mechanisms have in common is that they will affect only some individuals, at least in a severe manner. With most people, with most vaccinated people, this will be transient, okay? Transient, it will go away after some time. So you could say with these damage mechanisms, we have a case of Russian roulette, okay? Every now and then somebody loses, but most people will be unharmed. But there is one additional toxic mechanism to which I want to draw your attention, and this is the toxicity of the lipids themselves, okay? The lipids that are used to encase this mRNA are a mixture of some natural lipids, which are probably not of great concern, but there are also 2 artificial lipid species, which so far have never been used on humans, at least not in an approved manner. Okay, and as I will try to point out, is that here we have to expect that everybody will be will be affected. Everybody who gets these poisons injected will over time be affected by this lipid toxicity. At least this is something we have to fear. And right now we have no data from anywhere that could persuade us that this will not happen. There is a very good likelihood that this will happen. And we have not been told by the FDA or anybody else. Okay, I guess these numbers, they may already have been shown by Byram as well. Okay, so after intramuscular injection, the vaccine shows up fairly quickly in the bloodstream. It reaches its maximum after 2 hours and then goes down. And then we see accumulation occurring in various organs, liver and spleen, which is quite expected, right? It has to go somewhere at least at last. And liver and spleen are the 2 organs which are in charge to clear the bloodstream of stuff that shouldn't be swimming around there. But we also see accumulation in the adrenal glands and in the ovaries, okay? See the ovaries here, they accumulate, they are still going strong, accumulating after 48 hours. Now what we are seeing here is actually the accumulation of cholesterol, which is a natural lipid, which is also contained in this lipid mixture used to formulate these mRNA vaccines. We must expect, however, that the other lipids contained in the vaccine might distribute similarly. This may or may not be the case, but we have not been shown any data to persuade us that this would not happen, okay? And here we see that the 2 artificial lipids, right, for which we don't have comprehensive data on the distribution. What we do have, all we have is from this Japanese publication, the accumulation of a cationic lipid, which is of particularly grave concern in terms of toxicity. And this lipid accumulates in the liver, right? After 1 to 10 hours, we have maximum levels, but even after as much as 2 weeks, right? The last data point is after 2 weeks, we still have a fairly high level in the liver. So it is very slowly eliminated. Okay, the other lipid disappears a little bit faster. Apparently, it's also faster broken down. So this lipid is particularly of concern in terms of toxicity, and as we now see, it is also very persistent, right, in the liver, but it might also very well persist in other tissues, particularly in fat tissue, but also in these glands, which we saw earlier, the ovaries and the adrenal glands, because they take up so-called lipoprotein particles, right? And it is very possible, even likely, that these cationic lipids swim around the body packaged into these lipoprotein particles. Okay, I think I will skip this one. I will just simply point out that this is a very fat-soluble molecule, okay? And it could have been created in such a manner as to be broken down more rapidly than it is, but it is a very slow process. The breakdown, which is shown here, this is the first step of the breakdown, is a very slow process, okay? Now, you may be aware of a compound named DDT, which is an insecticide, and you may have heard that this compound can accumulate in the human body and stay there for years, for decades even. Right, and this is because it is very fat soluble. It simply hides away in fat droplets and fat tissue, but also in more important tissues. For example, it will be found in the liver. It will also be found in these aforementioned glands. Now, we have to expect pretty much the same thing with this cationic lipid. Okay, it might last not quite so long, but it will probably last long enough in the body for there to be cumulative toxicity. Okay. Cumulative toxicity would mean that with each shot, the level with each successive vaccination, justified by the latest variant announced on the CBC, right, you will get another dose, another cumulative dose of the toxin, and you will be poisoned some more. Okay, so what we will have here is these successive multiple vaccinations might very well be a scheme of slow cumulative poisoning. Another point I would like to make, right, that from the animal data, limited as they are, we would have had to expect rapid appearance of the spike protein in the circulation, resulting in blood clots. We would have to expect toxicity in organs with high rates of uptake of the vaccine. And we would also have to expect accumulation in the placenta and lactating breast glands. Even so, this was not reported in that study. For biochemical reasons, we would have to expect high rates of accumulation there. And indeed, right, all of these risks, which could be inferred from the results of those animal studies published in Japan, we could expect these things. None of them were monitored in the clinical trials, which were fast. And now we see all of them manifest in vaccinated people. We see stroke, we see fetal death, we see even in a few cases death of breastfed infants, right? All of this could be known, could at least be feared, could be guessed, and should have been tested in thorough experiments simply based on these rudimentary data, which were in fact filed with the authorities. But Pfizer did not monitor any of this in clinical trials, and the authorities did not ask for it. Okay, so I already covered this more or less, right? With repeated vaccination, we would have to expect risks, in particular for fertility, because we saw a high rate of accumulation in the ovaries, right? And we also would have to expect potentially, even though the accumulation is much lower in the testes, we might still see some damage there. Okay, so we would have to see the data in order to persuade us that this would not be happening, but none of the regulators seem to even have asked for this data, okay? So what this takes me to is the conclusion. Actually, the most important one is probably not stated here, but I already stated it before. You are not protected by the authorities. The authorities are not functioning. They are not enforcing proper drug testing to ensure safety of these vaccines. There is no adequate safety data. What we do know in the meantime is that the vaccines don't work, and so therefore they won't prevent transmission. There's absolutely nothing to justify the vaccination, not to mention mandatory vaccination. Mandatory vaccination cannot be rationally justified, and it is just very plainly a crime against humanity. As parents, you have to protect your children, no matter what. If you have to deny the medication, protect your children. This must come first. Don't let any school force anything on you. Don't let anybody persuade you to have yourself or your children vaccinated. Don't do it. Protect yourself. This is the hour in which you have to fight for yourself and for your children. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Palmer. I learned about 15 new things in that one, so thank you. Appreciate you coming.
Thank you for the opportunity. That's all I can say is thank you for your courage, CHD. You are just great people.
You have our utmost respect I don't even have words right now. Wow, I'm just blown away at what is occurring and what people think is occurring. It's just, anyways, thank you all so much for sharing your expertise with us and taking on all the negative feedback for what you do and speaking the truth. You really don't deserve it. And well, just know that
I'm not listening.
I love it. I love it. Most of the people up front aren't listening, but I want to say it comes from a place of fear within others. And what you're all doing is shattering that belief system by using actual science practices the way it's meant to be and questioning the unquestionable in this day and age. So thank you for being here, for joining us, and for not backing down, especially for our children. So thank you. And now I want to bring on everybody's favorite lawyer, Mr. Rocco Golotti. He's in here waiting very patiently, and we've kept him long enough. Welcome back. And I'm hoping Byram is still here. I can see that he's in here, but I know he was having some camera issues. So hopefully he's there. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
I think I understand from the chat room that Byram might want to share some sort of chart with us before he finishes off, before I wrap it up. Is that right, Byram?
Yep, wonderful.
Sure, yeah, that'd be great if you don't mind, Rocco.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So I saw that in the chat for the people who are watching this. I can't respond directly, but somebody did ask for a reference for something that I mentioned. Just before I show the reference as well, it's great. I've got a whole team of scientists and physicians who we all believe in making sure that the science we promote is 100% accurate. They pointed out that during my presentation, on my slide number 15, I had shown you, highlighted in yellow, a quotation of one of the vaccine manufacturers stating themselves that they never did the biodistribution studies that would normally be done for their vaccine. I had mislabeled the titles on that as Moderna. It was actually Pfizer's own data, and that's important because it's the Pfizer vaccine that's being put into our children. So I just want to, so for the person who asked in the chat, thank you very much, because this is cutting edge information. And so I want to make sure that you have it available. I suspect that people will want to have this. So I'm just going to share my screen and see. Okay, hold on here. I have to pull up the right window. Okay. Now let's see if I can do this. Okay. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen. Okay, good. So that's up there. So everybody's watching should be able to see this. So what this was I had mentioned when in my presentation, and actually I had recalled slightly different. I think I said 63%, right? There was cutting edge data suggesting, that was published suggesting that had we implemented effective treatments, we might have been able to prevent up to 63%. It's actually 56% of deaths due to COVID-19. So what I just want to show you is this. So this is being recorded, and presumably the recording will be available to people. So you can just come to this slide and get the information from here. But it's this journal, Open Form Infectious Diseases. This has just been, you can see it right up here. This manuscript has just been accepted. All right, so it's undergone full peer review, and it's been accepted for publication. It's not an official part of one of the journal issues yet, but it will be officially published in one of the upcoming issues. And in here, the text is cut off, I believe. No, right here. So right where I'm showing you right now, this is where it says, see, 56. So this is for ivermectin. This meta-analysis. So just so you understand what a meta-analysis is, this is kind of
I don't. They must have cut him off. They didn't like what he was saying, Rocco.
I guess so. Well, I'm sure we'll get another opportunity with Dr. Brittle to present again. And anyway, people can just go to that study and read it. Typically, these peer-reviewed studies are very concise medical studies. They're not long in the tooth. In terms of wrapping up, what we see really, see is that, and just focusing on the school children in primary and elementary school, what we see, it's consistent from, is that these measures against children are not ethically justified. They're not medically or scientifically justified. In fact, everything goes to the contrary. And more importantly, and as importantly, they're not legally justified. They run renegade of the law, including the statutory right. Oh, there you are, Byram. I'm sorry, I started in on my wrap up because we thought we lost you for good. Do you want to finish up?
Sure. Yeah. If you don't. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Sorry, my battery went dead.
Yeah.
I don't have to show the screen again. Where I got cut off was I was just circling there the text that states that with ivermectin, the meta-analysis suggests there would have been a 56% reduction in mortalities due to COVID-19. And the other thing is, just so you understand, a meta-analysis is kind of the highest, scientific level of evidence that you can generate, because what it does is it takes an accumulation of a whole bunch of data from multiple randomized controlled clinical studies and pools all the data together. So it's a really powerful analysis. And I think that is very sobering when one sees this number published, suggesting that had ivermectin been implemented, for example, in Canada, and many of our physicians have been fighting for this for over a year now, so think about it. Say a year ago, ivermectin was approved for use in Canada. This data suggests 56% of the Canadians that have died would be alive today. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Rocco.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you, Byram. Yeah. So,
Byram, do you have a few minutes for a couple questions? I know there were, Raji, are we going to do this? Okay. Yeah, okay. Rocco, you finish up.
Oh, well, I'm happy to have Byram take questions.
Because I want you to conclude this whole segment because,
Okay, I'll do that then. Okay. All right. So as I was saying, we know that the school measures against our children are not ethically justified. They're not medically or scientifically justified. And moreover, as a lawyer in asserting and trying to protect our children's rights, they're not legally justified. Under the Education Act in Ontario and Section 7 of the Charter, our courts have determined that education is a constitutional right that's entrenched, that's recognized under Section 7 of the Charter, in addition to all the international conventions, some of which are read into Section 7 of the Charter that Mrna mentioned. And so what do we have is not only school officials, but public officials taking the law into their own hands like your common day criminal. School teachers who don't, school principals and administrators and superintendents who don't even abide by the provincial emergency measures, let alone the rights of the children under the Act and the Constitution. We have public health officers propagating the idea that a 10 and 11-year-old can take a vaccine without parental consent. They're ignoring the fact that under our legislation, medical experimentation arising from the Nuremberg Principles and Code after Nazi Germany is a crime against humanity. And that's why the Nuremberg Principles were enunciated along with the Helsinki Declaration of 1960, directed at doctors to not allow for medical experimentation without informed voluntary consent. A 10 or 11 or 12-year-old child does not have the legal capacity to even consent. And so what you see is these people taking the law into their own hands. And so children obviously are the most vulnerable members of our society. They don't have the wherewithal to protect themselves. It's our duty as parents and adults at large in our society to protect their rights. They're primary. And so this is what we're doing. We're walking into court with this application. And of all the applications we have in court and the actions we have, I see this as the most important and the most critical because of who we're dealing with. You know, we are defending doctors in British Columbia and Ontario on the gag orders that their colleges are trying to put on them for speaking freely with expertise. We have 5 Superior Court applications, both in BC and in Ontario, with respect to challenging the right, quote, right of the colleges to put, I mean, they've actually published a policy that says no doctor can say anything that's critical of any public health officer with respect to the COVID-19 measures. We haven't seen this level of suppression since the most vicious dictatorships in Russia, Germany, fascist Italy. I mean, this is just over the top. And so we're defending those doctors. We have police officers who have a serious concern, and we filed that application back in April as well, about the measures that they're expected to enforce. And so we have all these challenges, but as I said, this one with respect to school reopening and our school children is, in my view, the most important. And following not far behind is the notice that Children's Health Defense Canada put through the Constitutional Rights Center, is the warning to all universities and colleges in Ontario who are trying to enforce and will be enforcing, in quotation marks, a mandatory vaccine policy as a condition of pursuing their education. That's totally unlawful too. They have no legal basis to do that. And they're not just enforcing it as a measure of entry into university, they're enforcing it against students who are poised to graduate in 1 or 2 semesters after putting in years into that university. The right to refuse any and all medical treatment as an adult is been recognized by the Supreme Court to be a Section 7 charter right. No one is required to undergo any medical treatment without their informed voluntary consent. And no university or college and no tin pot chancellor or president of an institution like that has any right to just come down and do the dirty work of the public health officers, because they know they can't impose. The public health officers know they cannot impose a mandatory vaccination policy for universities or anywhere else for that matter. So they try to hide under the transparent fig leaf of saying, quote, private entities like universities and colleges are imposing that requirement. Well, they don't have any right to impose it. If the state couldn't impose it, they have no right under contract to impose an unconscionable term, nor do they have any right to even ask the student, are you vaccinated or not? Any more than they would have the right, are you currently undergoing a STD that we need to know about? Or are you HIV positive that we need to know about? That's not justifiable. So neither is this, are you vaccinated with the COVID-19 experimental inoculation, a valid question they can even put to students. So I thank everybody out there watching. I thank you for your support. Thanks for Children's Health Defense Canada for putting on this broadcast today. And I implore everyone to keep an eye to protecting your children and other people's children, and not just be paralyzed by the uncommon sense, irrational fear-mongering and extortion that's being engaged in by public health officers and institutional types. When the evidence, the scientific and medical evidence is clear as a bell, you know, that children are not at risk and that these measures are unwarranted, and moreover, they're causing manyfold more deaths and more damage than they're purporting to prevent. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being a part of this journey with us and leading the charge. It means so much to all of the parents out there, I know. So from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much, Rocco and Mrna, and Dominic as well. I know you're backstage still waiting, so we apologize for that. But what I want to do right now is I want to bring on someone most of you all know. It's Raji, and she's going to ask some questions of our guests. So Raj, if you can come on in, you'll know Raji from Wholehearted Media. So go and check her out when you get a chance.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Raj, sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
And then I think Amina's gone. So, but yeah, you got a few questions, eh?
Yeah, so I've been backstage and just kind of looking at the questions and stuff. But before I go right in, Dr. Bridle, do you want to address the question? Because that was actually leading into one of the questions. People are wondering, what do I do when my doctor won't prescribe some of the drugs that will be helpful?
Sure. Yeah, so I noticed people asking that question. So, yeah, it's very sad in North America that we have been so resistant. I personally, as a scientist, will stay away from drawing too many conclusions. But drugs like ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, fluvoxamine, a lot of these things, a lot of the drug combination therapies that have been shown to be so effective against COVID-19, they're dealing with repurposed drugs. These are drugs that are off patent. Which means that they're typically very cheap. It also means there's no money to be made from them. So one of the things, based on that paper that I just showed you, I think, again, to put that in perspective, it's a little scary because Dr. Fauci in the United States has just declared, that they're spending billions of dollars, investing billions of dollars because they think that something that's missing from our toolbox in this fight against COVID-19 are early treatment strategies. Remarkably, after what I just showed you, we have these excellent early treatment strategies, but we're missing these early treatment strategies. So we have to spend billions to develop new ones. And in fact, that money is being invested into research. Those will be drugs manufactured. So for example, ivermectin has been manufactured by Merck. It's off patent now. So guess what? Merck is one of the ones getting a massive amount of money to make a new antiviral that would be similar. We believe they'll be lucky if it's as good as ivermectin, but it will be on patent and there'll be a fortune to be made from it. So I just want to put that out there. Now, when it comes to ivermectin, what people have to understand is drugs like ivermectin are not being actively promoted by public health officials in Canada, but it can legally be prescribed. Any physician in Canada has the right to repurpose drugs as long as they have informed consent from their patient. Okay, so and what I want to do is I'll point everybody to Rocco is also a member, like I am, of the and Michael Palmer, who you just heard from. We're all members of the Canadian COVID Care Alliance. And I had that address to take. So if people wanted to see the scientific underpinnings for my vaccine messaging is on their website as well. It's all lowercase COVID Care. All lowercase Canadian COVID Care Alliance.org. I would direct you there because our group is loaded with physicians who have been actively prescribing ivermectin and successfully keeping their patients out of the hospital, especially out of the intensive care units, and preventing them from dying when they use their treatment strategies early, shortly after diagnosis. Now, the other thing that they're doing, that the Canadian COVID Care Alliance is doing, is they have a committee that's dedicated to the procurement of ivermectin. They have identified pharmacies across Canada that are willing to prescribe it, physicians that are willing to make the ivermectin and provide it. They're also developing a network of physicians who are willing to prescribe it. It's not yet available, but they are also working on a telemedicine initiative where the physicians within the Canadian COVID Care Alliance can prescribe ivermectin. The other thing that's there, if you go to their website, they also have what's called a Dear Doctor letter that anybody is welcome to provide to their physician. It is a letter that outlines the benefits of these early treatment strategies, and it provides them with a link to our physicians who will teach any physician in Canada who's interested how to safely administer and effectively administer these therapies. So it is available in Canada. There are people who are willing to prescribe it. It's a growing network. And if you want to learn more about that, go to the COVID Care Alliance and they will look after you. If nothing else, send them an email, say you want to know more about ivermectin. They'll give you all the information you need to know. And
Great.
can I just say one more thing, Raji, because I noticed that somebody from the University of Ottawa mentioned a comment and about these mandated vaccines. So I want to point out, first of all, I'd like to thank Rocco and Mrna for sending the letters that they have to the Canadian or especially Ontario colleges and universities about mandated vaccines for students who would need to live in residence. The other thing is that's happening are student athletes, varsity athletes are being told that they are going to they'll have to take the vaccines. It's going to be mandated. And one of the things I just want to point out for anybody who is a varsity athlete, who knows of a varsity athlete, right now this is just kind of I'll admit there's not peer-reviewed published data to back this up at the moment. So a lot of it is circumstantial evidence, but there is a growing concern that these vaccines, we've shown in some people, these vaccines can be outright dangerous. But even if they're not dangerous, there is evidence, especially among elite athletes, that it is relatively common for athletic performance to be blunted following receipt of these vaccines, and it could be a long-term effect. So that is something that elite athletes do not want to face. Okay.
Wow. Great. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. And your website is a wealth of resource right there. The next question, and I do have a law and a school question, but physicians are telling patients that this vaccine totally protects them. In fact, you need it to be protected. How accurate is that statement of protection from doctors? And is there validity to it?
Well, I mean, it's nonsensical when all the public health officials, including the World Health Organization, have come out and said that the so-called COVID vaccine does not, one, prevent the virus from being transmitted to you, nor two, does it prevent you from transmitting it to somebody. So ask yourself, how accurate could this lunacy be? The public health officials themselves have admitted such, and they have admitted publicly that all this COVID-19 inoculation does for you is to suppress the symptoms of COVID-19. A recent study issued in Israel showed that it dramatically even fails to do that with each passing month. So their original projection of it being, quote, 90% effective, meaning 90% effective in suppressing your symptoms, has gone down to about 30%. This is why now they're promoting a third and fourth shot per year. So that statement is complete lying lunacy, scientifically speaking, based on the representations of the public health officials themselves. So I don't know where doctors are getting this, except their marching orders from the colleges. And the colleges have no business telling a doctor how to treat a patient in the course of the doctor-patient relationship.
Okay.
I would agree. I would agree 100% with what Rocco said. Further, I would like to see more evidence before I would start drawing any conclusions this way. But there's some data, especially coming out of Scotland. They seem to have a little, well, whether it's a blip on the radar or a genuine new wave of deaths occurring in Scotland is still to be determined. But they have had an uptick in deaths recently. And of those deaths, the majority have been vaccinated individuals. A minority have been unvaccinated. It's causing some scientists to get concerned that this may be suggestive of vaccine-enhanced disease, which we did see with the first-generation SARS coronavirus vaccines, where in animal testing, they were eliciting very impressive looking immune responses, but they were inappropriate immune responses. And when challenged, the animals actually died faster and with more severe disease than the unvaccinated animals. And what's also of concern is for the reports for both Pfizer and Moderna. These are publicly available documents. You can go and get them from the FDA's website in the United States. They have summarized the original reports they received from the two companies. And for both vaccines, they indicate, if you go near to the end of them, they indicate that they cannot rule out vaccine-enhanced disease as a possibility, especially as vaccine-induced immunity starts to wane. And they indicate that whether or not that occurs will have to be evaluated at the time was either during the clinical trials or if they received approval, which they did, during the rollout. So this rollout is the time to evaluate whether or not we end up with vaccine-enhanced disease. This is part of this grand experiment. I hope it's not happening, but it might be with this Delta variant.
Now, add to that, Raji, the fact that several weeks ago, Luc Montagnier, who won the Nobel Prize for Virology in 2007, stated categorically that in his professional and scientific opinion, it is the vaccines that are causing the variants. Not only is he being ignored and he's been labeled fake news and misinformation, but the public officials, nobody's looking into his assertion. And furthermore, within a week of when he said that, our officials here in Canada went on a propaganda spree, including our Prime Minister, saying that the unvaccinated are responsible for the variants. So this is the kind of dynamic you're dealing with. You have eminent scientists saying, hey, I'm concerned about this. And our public officials who are supposed to protect us and investigate it on a scientific basis, just throwing out propaganda based on nothing but political agenda.
Yeah. Rocco, just on that point, I sent a letter to our National Advisory Committee on Immunization, which advises our government for the vaccination policies. So starting almost a year ago, I expressed the concern about the way these vaccines are designed, the way they're being rolled out. It all puts us at risk of promoting the emergence of immunoevasive variants that could be potentially more dangerous. They laughed that off. They officially rebutted my letter with a statement that it was pure speculation. And yet, when the government states what you just said, when you flip it around, they don't claim it's pure speculation. And this is the thing, Rocco, it makes zero sense because we know that naturally acquired, so the unvaccinated, if they get infected, they're either going to die or they're going to clear the infection. If they clear the infection, that's with an immune response. So if you've cleared the infection, by definition, you have mounted a lethal immunological pressure against that virus. It's not in the body anymore. Now, what promotes these variants? It's a combination of things. Anytime you have a biological entity that's prone to mutation, and these coronaviruses are prone to mutation, and you apply a selective, narrowly focused, non-lethal selection pressure. That's the important thing. It's just like misuse of antibiotics.
Right.
Or when we use non-lethal chemotherapeutic treatments for cancers. We see this everywhere. This is why it's based on sound scientific principles. When we do that, and you give that biological entity that's prone to mutation lots of time to adapt to that narrow, non-lethal pressure, that is the recipe for immunoevasive mutants. And that fits with the vaccines where we are applying very narrow immunity. We're focusing on one component of the virus, making it easy for it to alter its structure. We are doing this over a very long period of time. As you pointed out, is a non-lethal pressure because the vaccines are not designed to confer sterilizing immunity, which would be lethal pressure. They at best dampen the severity of disease. They do not prevent infection. And this is the recipe. This is the recipe for driving potentially dangerous variants. My concern is by messing around with this poor vaccination rollout, we are putting our children at risk of going from a population that is at essentially zero risk from COVID-19 to potentially having these vaccinated individuals breed some dangerous new variant that will put our children legitimately at risk. It's absolutely preposterous, but you're absolutely correct. They have flipped the tables, and they're actually now trying to use those arguments against us and convince everybody who's vaccinated that's the unvaccinated that are doing this. It's scientifically preposterous.
And what I need to add there, Byram, too, is for the first time in the history of vaccines, safe tested vaccines, we have the officials and the government agencies hoodwinking the population for the first time in history that you can only acquire immunity through vaccines, and that natural immunity all of a sudden doesn't exist. So when we talk about immunity, historically, we're talking about both natural immunity of the human body and the antibodies and all of that, and as you say, the tailored vaccine that gives you immunity from that particular virus. Now they're talking, and people are missing the messaging when people like Bill Gates and others who are propagating this agenda say, we want to get to vaccine dependency. People have to understand what that means. That is not the same as immunity, whether by vaccination or natural herd immunity, right? What he means is we want to get you to the point that without our vaccines, you'll probably die, because that's all they're doing is suppressing the symptoms. And people have to be alert to the language they're using. So, this is the first time, as I said, in history where these people are pretending or trying to sell the population the notion that immunity only comes from vaccines. This is criminal.
Oh, I've been preaching that right from the get-go. I don't understand how anybody can get away with saying that the goal is to get as many people immunized. The goal is to get as many people immune to the virus. And there's no question. The scientific literature is very clear. I find it ridiculous as a virologist or immunologist that I have to spend a year trying to convince people that the immune system actually works, that it actually does function. It's remarkable. Indeed, there's study after study, and again, glad these studies are coming out, but my goodness, it's like Immunology 101. They keep telling me, you know what, the immune system actually does what we've thought it does for all of these centuries. What we now know with the SARS coronavirus 2, when we get infected, the vast majority of people will clear the infection. They will have robust immunity. It'll be long lasting. There'll be memory. It's as long lasting as the pandemic's been going on so far. The bonus is that it is broadly reactive. We naturally respond. First of all, the vaccines often induce primarily antibodies. A natural response is nicely balanced. It produces antibodies and T-cell immunity. It also targets all the components of the virus, not one. So in theory, those who have achieved natural immunity are likely better protected against novel emerging variants than those who are vaccinated. That's the reality.
Right. And the only reason I mention all these points, Byram, and I am not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, but having put in about 4,200 hours on the COVID issue, I'm probably getting there on the COVID issue. However, the reason I bring these points up is to make people understand that in response to 100,000 years of evolution and immunology, and in response to the avalanche of scientific data, our governments are just throwing back political hogwash. And the only reason we listen to them is we have this distorted dystopian idea that anything the government says is good for us and is true. And I ask people again to just use their common sense when they say and ask of me, oh, you think the government would hurt us? Look around for the last 2,000 years and 5,000 years since the most ancient civilizations to this very day. Governments around the world, including our own, have engaged in genocide, war on false pretenses, civil war on false pretenses, systematic abuse and torture of their citizens. Now just look at that and then ask yourself why all of a sudden, because they've propagated something that's likely to want to make you go in your diaper, all of a sudden they're Mother Teresa and everything they say must be followed and listened to without question. Like, get a grip. Use the brain that you used to have.
Dr. Brittle, I know you have to go, but we have one more question for you. You spoke about polyethylene glycol. Is it standard to have that in vaccines?
Yeah. So not traditional vaccines.
Not traditionally. Okay. So why do you think it's in this one?
I think it's in this one because the vaccine platform was originally designed to be a gene therapy delivery platform and drug delivery platform. That is why. I actually, as a scientist, believe it was a mistake to leave it in there. I think it was left in the formulation because of the rush to get the vaccines out. So they had this delivery system. If you reformulate the delivery system, you have to go back to the drawing board and you have to do a whole bunch of studies again, and that would slow everything down. I think, and so I'll explain why. So a lot of people don't realize, yes, these vaccines are new. The lipid nanoparticle technology is not at all new. It's been around for decades. People have been working on it for decades. The reason why we're looking at using them for vaccines now is because they actually largely failed in the context of gene therapy, which was the original intended use. In gene therapy, what you want is you're trying to replace defective genes in the body. So you don't want an immune response against a gene therapy delivery system, or you simply don't get the corrective gene into the cells. So these were shown to be too immunogenic. So because it failed in the context of immunotherapy or gene therapy, where you don't want to mount an immune response, and they found it was actually mounting a fairly robust immune response, they figured, okay, well, then this might be useful as a vaccine platform. But the reason why polyethylene glycol was originally polyethylene glycol was hailed as a real breakthrough for the use of these lipid nanoparticles for gene therapy, because when you want to use gene therapy or use these lipid nanoparticles to deliver drugs, you want this to be as distributed as far and wide throughout the body as possible. So this gets back to the biodistribution study. This is why, as a scientist, I was not surprised to see that biodistribution data and to see that the vaccines are going throughout the body. Because if you're trying, so a lot of people don't realize this technology, lipid nanoparticles, were shown actually to be quite efficient in crossing the blood-brain barrier. So a lot of the drug companies originally thought this would be a great platform. We can, instead of having them carry a genetic blueprint, right? We could put drugs into them and get these drugs efficiently across the blood-brain barrier to treat things like Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, brain cancers, etc. So you want broad delivery, and it's the same thing. Gene therapy. If you're trying to correct a gene, you want to get that delivered to as many of the quotes defective cells as possible. So polyethylene glycol was added to these lipid nanoparticles to make it more difficult for the immune system to gobble up these lipid nanoparticles. So so the first thing that happens when something's put into our body, the first cells of our immune system that respond, we have 3 types of cells. They're all designed to gobble up particulate matter that comes into the body. And so if they gobble this vaccine up, these are things like macrophages and dendritic cells, for example. And if they gobble up these things, then obviously they're going to be useless as a gene therapy vector. So what was found is putting it into the polyethylene glycol made it very difficult for these cells that consume the lipid nanoparticles to grab onto them. In fact, it reduced the ability of our immune system to pick up these particles 5-fold. That meant, so this was hailed as a big breakthrough for gene therapy, because it meant that we were getting 5 times better distribution throughout the body than if the polyethylene glycol was not present. So now you put this in the context of the vaccine, where we're hoping to keep the vaccine in the shoulder, right? I would argue 2 things. So I would argue we'd actually have 3 advantages if polyethylene glycol wasn't part of the formulation. First, we would have probably about an 80% reduction in the systemic distribution of the vaccine, right? Which would alleviate a lot of the concerns that we had. We would also have a 5-fold greater increase in the uptake of the lipid nanoparticles by the very cells of the immune system that we want to target with a vaccine. So I would argue it would actually function better as a vaccine. And then as a bonus, it's thought that most of the anaphylactic reactions that are being caused by these vaccines are directed against the polyethylene glycol. So we would have none of those either. So in fact, the polyethylene glycol, I think, was a mistake. I think, I don't think it was done intentionally. I think what they recognized is, you know what, if we go and reformulate this, we're not going to be the first to the finish line here.
Mhm.
So we're just going to take this quickly to the finish line. I don't think we would have been aware of any of this if the spike protein did not prove to be harmful to the body. Because we could have distribution and have, distribution of spike protein, but if it's an inert protein and causes no harm, we wouldn't be aware of that. And we also wouldn't necessarily be aware of the fact that it might function better as a vaccine. So on all counts, I think the presence of the polyethylene glycol has contributed to a lot of the severe adverse events we're seeing with these vaccines. I think it's contributing to the relatively poor functioning of the vaccines, like Rocco just pointed out. I think it was a mistake, and it was a mistake made because it was rushed.
Thank you. I'm going to invite Dominic now to ask Dr. Brittle his question. I know he's been waiting.
Yeah, Dr. Brittle, thank you very much. I have, since they're talking about implementing the vaccine passport in Quebec, on a scientific basis, what do you think would be the best arguments to attack any vaccine passport, scientifically speaking?
Well, so honestly, with the emerging publicly available data, I have concerns that, first of all, the vaccines are not optimally protective. Right, we're seeing the Delta variant is we're being scared with the Delta variant, and I wouldn't be surprised if, because we just focus in Canada on cases alone, yes, we're going to see an increase in cases with the Delta variant. I think they're setting us up for another big lockdown come the fall. I wouldn't be surprised. The Delta variant there's no question it's more infectious. Seems to cause accelerated disease, but it actually seems to cause much less severe disease. For one thing, so we talk about the variant for a moment. It's like the common cold. Like, we don't need to be afraid. The common cold is very contagious and is an accelerated disease where you often show signs of illness within 2 to 3 days of becoming infected, but then it wraps up fairly quickly. But so on the vaccine side, the point is the Delta variant seems to have really unveiled a weakness. So we already saw this with AstraZeneca. The South African variant was largely able to bypass immunity conferred by the AstraZeneca variant. We're seeing that starting to happen with the Delta variant. So as these variants are emerging, the vaccines are becoming less and less effective, right? As I pointed out, naturally acquired immunity is far more effective because it's far more broad-based. We're not just targeting the spike protein. We're targeting all kinds of proteins. Naturally acquired immunity is going to be much more resistant to the effects of these emerging variants. So what we should be doing is, so by mandating vaccines, the other thing is we have to keep in mind, this is what really bugs me. So this is important. There's a Canadian study done by a colleague of mine out in British Columbia. It was published in a great peer-reviewed scientific journal. It suggests that up to 90% of healthy Canadian adults who weren't even aware that they had COVID-19 are immune, either due to cross-reactive immunity, because what we have been learning is that we're wrong in our assumption at the beginning that this was a virus to which we had no pre-existing immunity. We're actually finding there's quite a lot of cross-reactive immunity from people that have been exposed to other coronaviruses, like the common cold-causing coronaviruses. And we followed this up in Ontario, where we've tested some people, just a small number, but we've been finding, again, about 90% of adults seem to have immunity, cross-reactive or naturally acquired. And again, because for many people, this is not a major pathogen, especially children. So they get infected and they clear it. And like I said earlier on, they acquire potent natural immune responses. And so there's a concern here. You could have somebody who has a passport that says they got a steel needle in their arm, but some of those people were actually fine. In this study, what was surprising, this is not published, but what has been found is that some of the people that are vaccinated have no evidence of immunity, right? Some people are non-responders to the vaccines. So you could have somebody who has a passport that says they got the steel needle and actually have zero immunity. And then you could have somebody who hasn't got the steel needle in their arm, but has naturally acquired immunity, and they're far more protected than most of the vaccinated individuals. So you see, on that basis alone, it makes no sense, right? We're setting ourselves up for a system where we're actually encouraging narrower, less protective immunity in populations, and we're not acknowledging probably the large number of Canadians that are already broadly protected and better protected than those who are immunized. Further, what it does is applies pressure for those who are naturally immune to get the vaccine. And I saw a question in the chat asking if there's any potential harm. Well, yes, first of all, because of the biodistribution issue, where the vaccine can go throughout the body and seed the tissues, those cells. So, for example, you saw that Michael Palmer showed you as well the data with the ovaries and the adrenal glands. So, if you have cells in the ovaries and adrenal glands that start having the spike protein showing on their surface, and you have from the vaccine, and you have somebody who's naturally immune, which means they have antibodies, their antibodies are immediately going to start attacking their own cells. So, we believe that those who are naturally immune are at greater risk of potential side effects from the vaccination because of how these vaccines work and the fact that they make our naturally acquired immunity. Any antibodies we have against the spike protein will be targeting our own cells. That could set us up for potential autoimmune responses, and these might not be seen for long term, for a long period of time. The other thing is our bodies always try and maintain a state we call in science homeostasis. We try and keep numbers equal. That's why whenever you go and get a blood test done, they always have that normal range. Our bodies are always trying to keep our cell numbers in a certain range. And so if we vaccinate somebody who has natural immunity, we're going to dramatically boost the immunity against the spike protein because that's all that it targets. And this will compromise a little bit. It will have a drop in the number of cells that we have against all the other components against the virus. So we're going to have a slight narrowing of the immune response. Right. So, yes, I believe there's potential harm to those who are naturally immune to be forced to take the vaccine. On that basis alone, right, we have to stop this. When we have such a lack of vaccine doses right from the beginning, we should have been testing for naturally acquired immunity. We should not be vaccinating people who have immunity. This is like Rocco said, our immune systems work. If we have immunity, we don't need to be vaccinated. If we knew how many people were immune and it was truly in the ballpark of 90%, very few people would actually require vaccination at all. So in terms of what exactly, I mean, as a vaccinologist, I can give you lots and lots and lots of reasons why we shouldn't have vaccine passports. You can kind of take your pick. But I think overall, forcing that upon people are going to feel compelled as soon as that happens, because otherwise they're going to look at not being able to volunteer at certain places. They're not going to get jobs, or they're going to lose jobs. And we are going to harm these people. They're better off. Most of these people who have not been vaccinated likely have naturally acquired immunity. We've done the masking. We've done the physical distancing. That has not stopped the spread of the virus. We are probably much closer to naturally acquired herd immunity than we would ever appreciate. But in Canada, we've decided we don't want information. We don't want that information. We don't want that data. And if we ignore that, the vaccine passport ignores all that, and it's going to cause more harm than good to what I would argue is the larger proportion of the population.
Thank you very much for your answers. Thank you.
No problem.
Mrna, did you have a question? Okay.
Okay, I've got to run.
You got to go. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. It was great.
So much.
Take care. Thanks for all you do.
Thanks so much, Byram.
Thank you
very much. Thanks for joining us. Well, I guess that's
okay. So we got two more questions. We have some parental questions. Yeah. So is parental consent assumed, or must it be asked for and or given explicitly for children to be masked, isolated, or vaccinated in school facilities?
That's a complicated question that varies from province to province, because that's provincial jurisdiction. So generally speaking, there is an age of majority, and anything below that age of majority, you need parental consent. There is a general provision which tries to codify what they refer to as the mature minor doctrine, that any person who's legally a minor, and usually in most provinces 18 or 19, you can't do things like sign a contract or sue in your own name unless you're 18 or 19. However, with respect to medical treatment, a few provinces, BC, and there's a provision in Ontario that they try to stretch to mean that if the mature minor, 16 to 18 range, fully understands the nature of and fully understands the consequences of the medical treatment, they can give their consent. That's typically, the case law says that's typically in the situation where that mature minor who's 16 to 18 years old is faced with imminent harm or death, and car accident, there's no parent around, they just give their consent. However, outside the scope of immediate harm or death, the Supreme Court of Canada has made it clear in the Jehovah's Witnesses cases, as I call them, in terms of blood transfusion for operation, because there's a religious objection by the parents, where the court has said it's justifiable to supplant their decision by court order through child protection agencies, because children have rights too, and parents can't just decide to let their children die. In that narrow circumstance, then it applies. But the Supreme Court in those cases said, but this is not to exaggerate the use of the mature minor doctrine. It is not meant to supplant or get around parental consent. What we see now with the COVID vaccine injection of doctors offering ice cream and Nathan Phillips swear to 12-year-olds is absolutely criminal. No, they do not have that right. Parental consent is required for a 12-year-old or 13 or even a 15-year-old, depending on the level of understanding. And our Supreme Court has made it clear that obtaining informed voluntary consent from a minor is a very complex process. It's not meant to be done with the magic, the waving of a wand or pulling a rabbit out of your hat. You need people who around the child who can explain and who are satisfied that mature minor has fully understands. And a typical scenario would be, you can understand, whether a 15 or 16-year-old girl wants to go get an abortion, right? You can understand why in limited special cases, parental consent may not be one possible nor two desired, but you still doesn't mean you dispense of consent of a mature adult to explain that to the child, whether it be through child services or a doctor or what have you. Okay, so the simple answer is no, with that caveat and explanation.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn it back over
that would
to...
be the same thing that would be similar in Quebec too.
Right.
Children under 14 years old can consent to medical treatment, but in this case, I think the consent is not informed, and I think the age is higher when you want to subject them to experimentation.
Correct. Yeah.
So I think that since we're dealing with an experimentation with the vaccine, experimental treatment, I think that any consent is vitiated.
Right. Okay. Is that it, Raji, or?
I mean, we're going over 3 hours now, and there's always questions, right?
Yeah.
There's always
questions.
There's always questions.
Yeah. So I think this is where we're going to hit our stop. We blew way over by well over an hour. So Children's Health Defense Canada just wants to thank each and every one of you, Rocco, Anna, Dominic, RFK Jr., Mary Holland, Byron Bridle, Dr. Michael Palmer, Julie Panesi, and Larry. Thank you so much. And you know what, Raj? Wholehearted Media, I love you. I just love you. Thank you. This wouldn't be possible without you. So thank you so much. And to all of you watching, thank you for believing in our cause. And I mean, you can go over and donate at the Constitutional Rights Center under Educational Action. Again, our goal today is $250,000. So feel it in your heart. Help us out. Help us out. It affects every single Canadian. It affects every single child in this country, whether they want to believe it or not. At the end of the day, this serves everyone's freedoms and protects their rights. So thank you so much. And we'll see you again soon. Have a great night.
Thank you all.